Hi guys, it's Becky CME again. It's 12 a.m. in the morning and my kids are fast asleep, so I thought I'd take this opportunity of a quiet moment to share the next installment of my story. Now, where we left off, my mother, my birth mother, Daphne, gave me up for adoption to my adopted parents, sorry. Um, I was the fourth born in a family of three natural born children to my parents. My father was a pastor and I lived a pretty incredible life. I had an amazing role model in my father, who loved me like I was his own flesh and blood. And my mother, the same. You know, I was accepted into this family. I was the only black child in a family of white children and white parents. But, God knew and God was faithful. And yes, I had some things I needed to go through and getting over my identity issues, but we'll get to that later in a future part of my testimony or my story. When I was adopted, one of the things that my parents were really open about and strong about, and that is keeping the adoption open. So we had an open adoption where they wanted to incorporate Daphne, my birth mother, into their life as well, and so that I could have a relationship with my birth mother. I met Daphne when I was 6 years old, but at the time I was a bit too young to understand, so I was introduced to her as Auntie. And then through a series of events, she moved. My parents moved because my dad was following the call to go to Australia, to a church in Australia. And we actually lost contact for many, 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 many years. And the next part of my story happens, I suppose, when I was in just before being a teenager, when I was in the what they call the betweens. And we had moved back to New Zealand, and my dad was involved in a church in Nelson, New Zealand. When, unbeknownst to me, my mum and my dad had decided to make plans to try and track down my birth mother because they'd just made a decision after spending a year in New Zealand. My adopted mother, sorry, adopted, not birth mother, adopted mother was looking after my grandma who was dying of cancer, and my grandmother had since died, and they were making plans to move back to Australia. So they decided to. Oh, it all gets very complicated because, all the stuff happening. It's Australia, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand. So hopefully I'll keep my mind focused and actually tell you the story in the shortest time possible. So my dad actually went back to the pastor that had arranged the adoption right from the beginning and said, look, my daughter is starting to ask questions about her mother and who she was, and she's having, issues around who she is and where she came from and all that sort of stuff. Do you happen to know where Daphne lives now? Because we've tried to track her down. We can't track her down. We moved, she moved, and we'd really love to give Rebecca an opportunity to see her before we move to Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, which is where we were moving back to. And the pastor said, oh, yes, she's actually just been here with her husband and her two daughters, and she's now living in, guess where? Hobart, Tasmania. So without me knowing, my dad actually got in contact with Daphne and sent her a letter explaining that I was asking questions and would she like to meet up with me? If she didn't, that was all right because he understood that she might have moved on in her life and her husband and the people around her might not have known about the adoption. So he didn't want to sort of lump it on her in a public way before she had a chance to sort of let everyone know that she actually had a daughter, a long lost daughter. And she responded back straight away saying, oh, I've been praying for this moment. Yes, I do want to meet up with her. I've never forgotten her. I've thought about her on every birthday. And as a result, they reconnected. And so the first I knew about all this happening was as a girl of 13 years old when my parents came to me with a photograph. And in the photograph was two toddlers in a pushchair. And I remember seeing that photograph and they asked me, who are these, Beck? Who are these people? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. Who are they? And they ended up telling me that they were my little sisters, Claire and Louise, my birth mother's children. And wow, it was just, I was so shocked and amazed that my adoptive father had actually taken the time to track her down. And I remember I spoke to Daphne on the phone for the first time, and this was literally the first time when I was speaking to her as my mother, as my birth mum. And then when we actually moved to Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, I stepped off the plane, and that was the first time I met my mum. And I wanted to share that part of the story too because as an adopted child, I have had this incredible life where I have actually been connected first to my birth mother and then in later years to my birth father, but I'll tell you that story in an upcoming video. But, for my identity, it was really interesting that although she's actually white and I'm actually brown. When we met up, it was so amazing to see how much we were like each other. Our mannerisms the same, the way we walked together was the same, the way we talked, the things we liked. We're both very entertaining people. We love to feed people. And there was so much about her that made sense to me because in meeting her, I realized just how much of her was actually in me. Now, when we went up, Daphne actually told me that, she'd always hoped that she would meet me. When her husband had asked her to marry her, before he even asked her, she had told him, look, there's something you should know. I do have a daughter and she may come back into our lives. And you know what? If you're not up with that, then this isn't going to go anywhere. So she'd already prepared for that. And that was such a validating moment for me that as an adopted child, even though I'd never lived with my mother or she had courageously given me up for adoption, that, in her heart, I was still there. It wasn't that she'd given me up and just forgotten about me. She still loved me. She still prayed for me. She still hoped and hoped and hoped that one day she would find me and that we would reconnect and that she would know me. And God is just so faithful because He made that possible. But even more than that, He gave me parents, adopted parents that were able to make that possible. And that they were the ones that tracked her down. They were the ones that weren't intimidated by the fact that there was another important person in my life that could possibly come into my life one day. And there's a lot more on that story, but I'm going to leave it there for now and I'll tell you the rest in the next segment. Bye for now.